Hello, and welcome back on your mathematical journey. So today, I want to take a little look at polynomial vocabulary. Now, I don't like to dwell on vocabulary in general in math. I think that it can get really hard to get bogged down in definitions, but I did want to go over a few of these words that we use so that we don't have to have any questions later about how I'm using specific words. So I've jokingly put terminology here, right? Because it's a word for vocab, but also because the first word I want to talk about is what is a term when we're talking in mathematics? Well, a term, as we've written here, right, is either a number, a variable, or the product of numbers and variables. So let's go through examples of all of those, right? A number, well, we could have just the number, I don't know, 26, right? That would be a term. Right? Another term, right? Just a variable. We could just say the letter X is a term, right? Another term we could have, right, is lastly we could have a product of numbers and variables. So I could have 13 times Y times Z, right? Since this is all a product, right? We have combined them all together, right? This would also be considered an individual term. So each of these individually would be considered a term. Now note, when we're counting terms in an expression, the way we separate terms from each other is looking for either plus or minus signs. So sort of as I've written it here, I've kind of intended, sort of with commas, to sort of represent each of these as a single term. And I'll sort of show examples down here of what it's going to look like when we have more than one. So we can talk about how many terms an expression has by using this vocabulary down here, which should hopefully get more familiar in time. So what I've written up here, right, 26 or X or 13YZ, right, these would all be examples of monomial, right? I've underlined sort of the relevant prefixes here, right? Mono, meaning one. So these are examples of monomials because they have one term, right? Now, let's think about a binomial, right? Like a bicycle, which has two wheels. A binomial has two terms. So, if we wrote, for example, if we combined these two, if we said 26 plus x, right? Or we said maybe x minus 13yz, right? We've separated two terms with a plus. We've separated two terms with a minus. So these would both be individually would be examples of binomials, right? Now let's consider a trinomial, right? Like a tricycle or a triceratops, right? A trinomial is going to have three terms. So if I wanted to combine all of these with pluses and minuses, if I said 26 minus x minus 13yz, right? Now notice I have three terms. They're individually separated by pluses and minuses. So this would be considered an example of a trinomial. And then lastly, we use this term polynomial sometimes. Poly, the prefix meaning many or multiple. So all a polynomial means is that it means that you have an expression that has more than one term. So a binomial would be considered a polynomial. A trinomial would be considered a polynomial. And so on and so forth. If you had an expression with 35 terms, that would be considered a polynomial. Now, the one last note, I didn't write it down here that I want to make, is that when we are classifying expressions, whether they are monomial, binomial, trinomial, etc., we only start to count how many terms there are in the expression once we've combined all of the like terms. So, for instance, if you were given, let's say, 2x plus 5x minus 7, right? Well, your first thought might be that I have three terms, right? 2x, 5x, and 7. They're separated by pluses and minuses, so this might seem like it's a trinomial, but note that 2x plus 5x can be combined to just be 7x minus 7. Right, so this expression we would actually ultimately classify as a binomial, right? Because once we've collected all the like terms, right, we just have 7x and 7 separated by a minus sign. So this would be considered a binomial. Anyway, I hope that's a quick help as far as some vocab. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to leave them below. Otherwise, have a good day and happy mathing.